Welcome to Freshly Squeezed True Crime, a Florida-only true crime podcast. My name's Suhaili, and let's get to squeezin'. The city of Sanford is located in Seminole County with a population of 61,051 people as of the 2020 census and is part of the Orlando-Kissimmee-Sanford Metropolitan area in Central Florida. It was founded by Henry Shelton Sanford and was incorporated in 1877, and today is known as the Historic Waterfront Gateway City for its quaint, historic downtown with brick-lined streets, elegant Victorian homes, and unique shops and restaurants. On February 26, 2012, the nation's eyes would focus its lens on Sanford, and on July 13, 2013, in response to this case, we would see the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. Trayvon Benjamin Martin was born in Miami, Florida on February the 5th, 1995. His parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, divorced 4 years later. At the time of the shooting, Fulton was a program coordinator for the Miami-Dade Housing Authority, and Tracy Martin was a truck driver. They lived near each other in Miami Gardens. Martin's older maternal half-brother, Gervais Fulton, was a college student at the time. When Martin was 9 years old, he pulled his father, who had been immobilized by burns to the legs, out of a fire in their apartment, saving his life. Martin enjoyed sports video games. He washed cars, babysat, and cut grass to earn his own money. Martin had played football at the park since he was 5 years old, and his team was coached in part by his father. Another of Martin's former football coaches said Martin had been one of the best players on their football team, the Wolverines, that played at Forzano Park in Miramar, Florida. Martin played for the Wolverines from the ages of 8 to 13 and sometimes sat out because his father benched him because he would mess up in school. While in high school, Martin volunteered at Forzano Park, working in the concession stand and sometimes staying until 8 or 9 p.m. before going home. Martin's former football coach said he was a shy child and always walked with his hoodie and headphones on listening to music. Martin attended both Norland Middle School and Highland Oaks Middle School in North Miami-Dade County, Florida, with parents who wanted to expose him to the world. Martin had experiences that included skiing, horseback riding, and a trip to New York City to take in the sights. Tall and athletically inclined, with tattoos of family members and names on his frame. When Martin started high school, his goal of playing professional football was put aside in favor of a career working with airplanes. While in his freshman year at Carroll City High School, Martin attended classes in the mornings at the high school and then went to George T. Baker Aviation School for the rest of the school day. Martin's ninth grade teacher, who taught him 3 classes at aerospace technology at Baker Aviation School, said he was a normal student, well-behaved, who passed all his classes. According to another teacher at Carroll City, math was his favorite subject, and she said she never saw Martin show disrespect. Some students at Carroll City compared Martin's death to that of Emmett Till, one of the nation's most infamous civil rights cases. The often quiet Martin was highly interested in studying aviation and potentially becoming a pilot. In mid-2009, he was enrolled in Experience Aviation, a 7-week program in Opelika, Florida, run by award-winning aviation Barrington Irving. According to Irving, Martin was a polite youth who reminded him of himself because he had a strong interest in football until he fell in love with aviation. After Martin graduated from the program, he spent the next summer as a volunteer helping out new students in the aviation program. According to his parents, Martin had hoped to attend the University of Miami or Florida A&M University. Martin's mother had him transferred to Dr. Michael M. Kropp High School, which had approximately 2,700 students for his junior year. Fulton said that her son had an average performance in school and she transferred him because she thought Kropp High School was better and she wanted a different environment for him. While a student at Kropp High School, Martin had behavioral issues. At the time of the shooting, he was serving a 10-day suspension for having a marijuana pipe and an empty bag containing marijuana residue. He had been suspended twice before for tardiness and truancy and for marking up a door with graffiti. The suspension for graffiti was in October 2011 when Martin was observed by a school police officer on a security camera hiding and being suspicious in a restricted area of the school. According to the officer, he later observed Martin marking up a door with WTF, or what the fuck. When his backpack was searched the next day by Miami-Dade school police, looking for the graffiti marker, the officer found a dozen pieces of women's jewelry, a watch, and a screwdriver that was described by the school police officer as a burglary tool. The jewelry found in his backpack included silver wedding bands and earrings with diamonds. When Martin was asked by the officer if the jewelry belonged to his family or a girlfriend, he said a friend had given it to him. When asked for the name of the friend, Martin declined to provide it. The school police impounded the jewelry and sent photographs of it to detectives at Miami-Dade to investigate it further. No evidence surfaced at the time that the jewelry was stolen. An attorney for Martin's family said the parents did not know about the jewelry or the screwdriver. Martin was not charged with any crime related to these suspensions and did not have a juvenile record. Martin's cousin, Stephen Martin, who had been in the park telling jokes with Trayvon the night before his death, said that he and Trayvon had been like brothers growing up. He recalled that Trayvon had been very skilled in assembling, repairing, and riding pocket rockets, or pocket bikes and dirt bikes. Miriam Martin, Trayvon's aunt and Stephen's mother, said her nephew had often stayed over to visit family. She also said that Trayvon was found wearing a hoodie. It would be 100 degrees outside, and he always had on his hoodie. Friends of Martin, who had known him from Highland Oaks Middle School and Carroll City High School, and corresponded with him over Twitter, said Martin was not prone to violence. One friend said he was the walk-away type of guy. He'd rather walk away than fight. Another friend from Twitter, who had known him since middle school, said he was funny and liked to joke around and make people laugh. Trayvon's digital footprint would play a big role in the court of public opinion, although it should be taken with a grain of salt because they do not necessarily reflect what a teenager is like in person. Someone's online persona may not reflect the true image of who they are, especially when they're young people. George Michael Zimmerman was born on October 5, 1983, in Manassas, Virginia. He is the third of four children, and his siblings include brother Robert Jr. and two sisters, Grace and Dawn. His mother, Gladys Christina Zimmerman, was born in Peru. His maternal grandfather was of Afro-Peruvian descent, and his father, Robert Zimmerman Sr., is a U.S. Army veteran with a military career of 22 years, first as an Army sergeant and then 10 years at the Department of Defense. Before retiring to Florida in 2002, Zimmerman Sr. had served as a magistrate in Fairfax County's 19th Judicial Circuit. Zimmerman identifies as Hispanic on his voter registration forms. Zimmerman's family was known for being devoutly religious. He was raised Catholic and served as an altar boy from the age of 7 to 17. Zimmerman attended All Saints Catholic High School in Manassas before going to a public high school. At age 14, Zimmerman joined an after-school Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps program because he wanted to become a Marine. When Zimmerman was 15 years old, he held 3 part-time jobs on nights and weekends to save up for a car. Zimmerman graduated from Osborne High School in 2001. After graduating from high school, Zimmerman moved to Lake Mary, Florida, a suburb of Orlando, where he was employed by an insurance agency. Zimmerman took classes at night to obtain a license to sell insurance. It was during this time he became friends with Lee Ann Benjamin, a real estate agent, and her husband, John Dudley, a Sanford attorney. Benjamin and Donnelly would both testify on his behalf at his trial in the death of Martin. According to Donnelly, in 2004, Zimmerman and an African-American friend opened the satellite office of Allstate Insurance, which failed a year later. In July 2005, Zimmerman was arrested after allegedly assaulting an undercover police officer who was attempting to arrest a friend of his at the bar. The charges were dropped after Zimmerman agreed to enter an alcohol addiction program. A month later, in August, Zimmerman's former fiancée filed a restraining order against him, citing domestic violence as the cause. Zimmerman married Shelley Dean, a licensed cosmetologist, in 2007. 2 years later, they rented a townhouse in the Retreat at Twin Lakes in Sanford, Florida. Zimmerman had previously been employed at a car dealership and a mortgage audit firm. Zimmerman enrolled in Seminole State College in 2009 and was working on an associate's degree in criminal justice. in December 2011, he was allowed to participate in a school graduation ceremony, although he was one course shy of his degree. He was completing that credit at the time of the shooting. Zimmerman was employed as an insurance underwriter. In late February 2012, Martin spent his third high school suspension day visiting his father, whom he was close to, and his father's fiancée, Brandy Green, at Green's home in the gated community known as the Retreat at Twin Lakes in Sanford, Florida. The Retreat at Twin Lakes is a 260-unit gated townhome community with a population makeup of 49% non-Hispanic white, 23% Hispanic of any race, 20% Black, and 5% Asian. In response to a rash of robberies and burglaries, the residents of the community established a neighborhood watch in September of 2011. Zimmerman, one of the residents, was selected as the program coordinator. He regularly patrolled the streets, and he was licensed to carry a firearm, which he was licensed to carry since November of 2009. From August 2011 to February 2012, Zimmerman had called police several times to state he had seen individuals whom he had deemed as suspicious. All of the reported figures were Black males. According to friends and neighbors of Zimmerman, 3 weeks prior to the shooting on February 26, Zimmerman called police to report a young man peering into the windows of an empty Twin Lakes home. By the time police arrived, the suspect had fled. On February 6, workers witnessed two young Black men lingering in the yard of a Twin Lakes resident. Around the same time, a new laptop and some gold jewelry was stolen from her home. The next day, police discovered the stolen laptop in the backpack of a young Black man that Zimmerman identified as the same person he spotted peering into windows on the 2nd of February. Tracy Martin said he took his sons to Sanford to disconnect and get his priorities straight. Martin had been to Twin Lakes several times before with his father and sometimes played football with other kids in the neighborhood. On the night of the shooting, Tracy was out to dinner with his fiancée, Brandy Green, while Tracy and Green's sons stayed at home watching TV and playing video games. Trayvon went out, walking to a local 7-Eleven store where he bought Skittles candy and an Arizona watermelon drink. From his SUV, Zimmerman called the police department at 7:09 p.m. Zimmerman said, "We've had some break-ins in my neighborhood, and there's a really suspicious guy." He described an unknown male just walking around, looking about in the rain, and said, "This guy looks like he is up to no good, or he is on drugs or something," end quote. Zimmerman reported that the person had his hands in his waistband and was walking around looking at homes. He also mentioned that Martin was wearing a dark hoodie, like a gray one. On the recording, Zimmerman is heard saying, "These assholes, they always get away." About 2 minutes into the call, Zimmerman said he's running, end quote. The dispatch asked, "He's running? ? Which way is he running?" End quote. Noises on the tape at this point have been interpreted by some media outlets as the sound of a car door chime, possibly indicating Zimmerman opened his car door. Zimmerman followed Martin, eventually losing sight of him. The dispatcher asked Zimmerman if he was following him. When Zimmerman said yes, the dispatcher said, "We don't need you to do that." Zimmerman responded, "Okay." Zimmerman asked that the police call him upon their arrival so he would provide his location. Zimmerman ended the call at 7:15 p.m. After Zimmerman ended the call with police, a violent encounter took place between him and Martin, who was 5'11" and 158 pounds at the time of his death. It ended with Zimmerman fatally shooting Martin, who did not possess any weapons, just 70 yards from the rear door of the townhome where Martin was staying with his father. Police arrived 2 minutes later of the gunshot. Sanford police officer Timothy Smith arrived at the scene at approximately 7:17 p.m. He reported finding Zimmerman standing near Martin, who was laying face down in the grass and unresponsive. At that time, Zimmerman stated to Smith that he had shot Martin and was still armed. Smith handcuffed Zimmerman and confiscated his black Keltec PF9 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Smith observed that Zimmerman's back was wet and was covered with grass, and he was bleeding from his nose and the back of his head. Ricardo Ayala, the second officer to arrive that night, noticed Officer Smith had Zimmerman in custody, then observed Martin laying face down in the grass and attempted to get a response from him. At this time, Sergeant Anthony Raimundo arrived and together with Ayala began CPR. Paramedics from Sanford Fire and Rescue arrived and continued CPR, finally declaring Martin dead at 7:30 in the p.m. Zimmerman arrived at the police station at 7:52 p.m., according to a police video. He was interviewed by investigator Doris Singleton and by Detective Chris Serino. Crime scene detective D. Smith photographed his injuries and hands and collected gunshot residue. Zimmerman's weapon was placed into evidence. His clothes also taken as evidence after his wife arrived with a change of clothes. 5 hours later, Zimmerman was released. The police chief said that there was no evidence to refute Zimmerman's claim of having acted in self-defense, and under the Florida Stand Your Ground statute, the police were prohibited by law from making an arrest. The police chief also said that Zimmerman had a right to defend himself with lethal force. Later released video footage of Martin shopping for treats at 7-Eleven showed no criminal or aggressive behavior. In later interviews, it was revealed that Martin was on the phone with his girlfriend when he was spotted by Zimmerman. She stated that Martin noticed that he was being followed by someone and thus began to run, with the two soon losing contact with each other via Martin's earpiece. Martin's body was taken to the morgue where he was tagged as a John Doe, as he was not carrying any identification. The mobile phone found at the shooting scene was malfunctioning to the point that the police Celebrate data recovery device could not access it. Martin's father, Tracy Martin, called to file a missing persons report early on February 27th, and police officers arrived at his fiance's condo with photographs of his dead son at about 9:20 in the a.m. Having gotten legal representation, Martin's parents also created a Change.org document that received more than 2.2 million signatures calling for Zimmerman to be placed under arrest. The case became a social media phenomenon and a national story, with Zimmerman's critics alleging that racial epithets may have motivated his actions. On March 12, 2012, Police Chief Lee turned the investigation over to the state attorney's office for review. Lee said there was not enough evidence to arrest Zimmerman. Quote, "In this case, Mr. Zimmerman has made the statement of self-defense. Until we can establish probable cause to dispute that, we don't have the grounds for arrest." End quote. On March 13, 2012, Detective Chris Serino sent a KPS request to the state attorney's office recommending charges of negligent manslaughter against Zimmerman, though Serino maintains he did not believe they had any evidence to support those charges, and the manslaughter was only included in the KPS in order for the prosecutor's own office to continue their investigation. The KPS states the following: "The encounter between George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin was ultimately avoidable by Zimmerman if Zimmerman had remained in his vehicle and waited the arrival of law enforcement, or conversely, if he had identified himself to Martin as a concerned citizen and initiated a dialogue in an effort to dispel each party's concern. There is no indication that Trayvon Martin was involved in any criminal activity at the time of the encounter." End quote. The state attorney's office initially determined there was insufficient evidence to charge Zimmerman and did not file charges based on this KPS request. The Volusia County medical examiner found that Martin was killed by an injury resulting from a single gunshot to the chest, fired at intermittent range between 1 and 18 inches, according to a forensics expert. An FDA analysis of Martin's body and clothes described the distance as a contact shot. The autopsy also found that Martin had one small abrasion on his left ring finger below the knuckle. No other injuries were found on Martin's body at the time of his death. Physicians who reviewed the official autopsy report for the Orlando Sentinel stated, in their opinion, that Martin lived from 20 seconds to several minutes after he was shot, and that Martin likely remained conscious for a little while after. The autopsy report stated that Martin had traces levels of THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, in his blood and urine. The toxicology report found levels to be 1.5 nanograms. Larry Kobolewski, a professor of forensic science, stated that the THC amount was so low that it may have been ingested days earlier and played no role in Martin's behavior. While under oath, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy testified that marijuana could have no effect or some effect on Martin's behavior. On April 11, 2012, an affidavit of probable cause was filed in support of a second-degree murder charges against Zimmerman. The affidavit describes what investigators allege took place between Zimmerman and Martin on the night of the shooting. Prosecutors alleged that Zimmerman profiled Martin as he was walking back from the nearby 7-Eleven store to the townhome where he was temporarily living. Prosecutors said Zimmerman was driving in his vehicle when he saw Martin and assumed he was a criminal and perceived that Martin was acting suspicious and felt that he did not belong in the gated community. Zimmerman called the police, and prosecutors said dispatch told Zimmerman an officer was on the way and to wait for him. In the call, Zimmerman made reference to people he felt had gotten away with break-ins in the neighborhood. Investigators alleged that while Zimmerman was talking to the dispatch, Martin was on the phone with a friend, and she said that Martin was scared because he was being followed by an unknown man. Investigators said that Martin attempted to run home, but Zimmerman followed him because he didn't want Martin to get away. When the police dispatcher realized Zimmerman was following Martin, they told Zimmerman that was unnecessary and that police would meet him there. Prosecutors alleged that Zimmerman ignored the dispatcher and continually following Martin and confronted him, and a struggle ensued. When police arrived at the scene, Zimmerman admitted to shooting Martin in the chest. After Seminole County Circuit Judge Jessica Rexeller removed herself, Kenneth Lester Jr. took the case upon himself as the judge. At a pretrial hearing on April 12th, Judge Mark Kerr ruled that the affidavit was legally sufficient to establish probable cause. Court documents, including witness statements and other information, were sealed at the request of the defense team, and Zimmerman's arraignment was scheduled for May 29th. Zimmerman took the witness stand at a bail hearing on April 20th and told the parents of Martin he was sorry for the loss of your son. Zimmerman was released on a $150,000 bond and was fitted with an electronic monitoring device for monitoring his whereabouts in real time. Zimmerman's attorney waived Zimmerman's rights to appear at the arraignment and entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. In June 2012, Judge Lester revoked Zimmerman's bonds and sent him back to jail after the prosecutor alleged that Zimmerman and his wife had misled the court about their finances at an earlier bonds hearing. Zimmerman's wife had testified at the hearing that they had very little money, and neither she nor Zimmerman revealed to the court that he had received $135,000 in donations. The prosecution alleged that recordings of telephone conversations Zimmerman had with his wife from jail showed that they had been speaking using a code about their finances, with repeated mentions of Peter Pan, in an apparent reference to PayPal account. The judge charged Zimmerman's wife with perjury, and at a second bond hearing for Zimmerman held the following month, re-released Zimmerman with the new bond set at $1 million. Zimmerman's attorney, Mark O'Mara, filed a motion to disqualify Judge Lester, alleging that Lester had made disparaging and gratuitous remarks about his client in July 2012 in the bond order. O'Mara said the judge's statement that he believes Zimmerman had misled the court at his first hearing was indication of a bias against Zimmerman and would impact Zimmerman's ability to get a fair trial. The state criticized the motion for citing facts that are inaccurate, misleading, and/or incomplete. When Judge Lester refused to recuse himself and ruled that the defense motion was legally insufficient, the defense appealed. On August 29, 2012, the 5th District Court of Appeal granted the petition for a new judge for the trial. Circuit Judge Deborah Nelson was assigned to the case. Judge Deborah Nelson of the 18th Circuit Court of Florida was the 4th judge to preside over the case. Nelson had been a judge for 13 years, much of it handling criminal matters. Before becoming a judge, she had worked in civil litigation. On the advice of his counsel, Zimmerman did not speak to the media after the shooting. The statements he gave to police investigators were publicly released on June 21, 2012, when Zimmerman's attorney, Mark O'Mara, published his written and recorded statements on Zimmerman's legal defense website. Prior to the release of the statements, the only publicly available information about Zimmerman's version of the incident came from interviews with some of his family members and friends, and from leaks to the news media by sources inside the investigation, and his recorded phone call to 911. Zimmerman maintained his public silence until he was interviewed by Sean Hannity of Fox News on July 18, 2012. According to early news reports of the incident on the night of the shooting and afterwards, Zimmerman described in detail for investigators what took place. Zimmerman said he was driving to the grocery store when he spotted Trayvon Martin walking through the neighborhood. Zimmerman's father said that while his son was not on duty that night as neighborhood watch captain, there had been many break-ins and he thought it was suspicious that someone he did not recognize was walking behind townhomes instead of on the street or on the sidewalk. Zimmerman therefore called a non-emergency police line to report Martin's behavior and summoned the police. During the call, Zimmerman told the dispatch that Martin was, quote, coming to check me out, end quote. A source to the Orlando Sentinel said in May that Zimmerman told investigators that at one point, Martin circled his vehicle and he rolled up his window to avoid a confrontation. After telling the police dispatcher that Martin, quote, ran, Zimmerman left his vehicle on Twin Trees and walked down the street between Twin Trees and Retreat View Circle to determine his location and ascertain in which direction Martin had fled. The dispatcher asked if Zimmerman was following Martin, and Zimmerman replied, yeah. Then the dispatcher said, okay, we don't need you to do that. Zimmerman replied, okay, and stated that Martin got away. After a discussion about where Zimmerman would meet police, the call ended, and Zimmerman told investigators he was returning to his vehicle after locating an address on Retreat View Circle when Martin approached him from his left rear and confronted him. According to Zimmerman, Martin then punched him in the face, knocking him down, and began beating his head against the sidewalk. Zimmerman said he called out for help while being beaten. At one point, Martin covered his mouth to muffle the screams. According to Zimmerman's father, during the struggle, while Martin was on top of Zimmerman, Martin saw the gun Zimmerman was carrying and said something to the effect of, quote, you're going to die now, you're gonna die tonight, end quote, and continued to beat Zimmerman. Zimmerman and Martin struggled over the gun, and Zimmerman shot Martin once in the chest at close range. Zimmerman told police he shot Martin in self-defense. On June 21, 2012, Zimmerman's attorneys released audio tapes of several interviews he had with police shortly after the shooting. Also included were Zimmerman's written statement of February 26, 2012, video recordings of his reenactment of the incident, and a voice stress test that he passed. On July 18, 2012, Zimmerman, accompanied by his attorney, Mark O'Mara, gave his first long media interview to Sean Hannity, and part of the interview appeared on Hannity that evening. During the interview, Zimmerman said he did not regret his actions on the night of the shooting and that he felt that what had happened, quote, was all God's plan, end quote. However, towards the end of the interview, he backtracked and said, quote, I do wish there was something, anything I could have done that wouldn't have put me in the position where I had to take his life. I want to tell everyone, my wife, my family, my parents, grandmother, the Martins, the city of Sanford and America, I'm sorry that this happened. I am truly sorry, end quote. Martin's parents said they did not accept Zimmerman's apology for killing their son. Martin's mother, Sabrina Fulton, said she doubted that Zimmerman's apology was sincere. Quote, I have a hard time accepting it because he also said that he doesn't regret anything that he did that night, end quote. Under Florida law, the use of deadly force against an attacker is permissible in certain situations. The adoption of the Stand Your Ground law in 2005 modified the self-defense law so that a person who reasonably believes they must use deadly force to prevent serious injury to themselves may lawfully do so without first attempting to retreat from an attacker. Prosecution for using deadly force in such situations is prohibited. A defendant in a homicide case who claims to have acted in self-defense may petition the court to grant the defendant immunity from prosecution under these provisions of the law. Legal experts say that in a pretrial immunity hearing, the burden of proof is on the defendant to show a preponderance of the evidence that they acted lawfully, whereas in a trial by jury, the burden of proof is on the prosecution, who must show beyond a reasonable doubt, a much higher standard than required for establishing the preponderance of the evidence, that the defendant acted lawfully. In this statute, which enabled George Zimmerman to initially be released from the police after the shooting, considering Zimmerman had been justified by the law to protect himself and there was no evidence to counter his claims, Zimmerman was legally prohibited from the arrest. In the months that followed, the defense received the first round of discovery evidence, 67 compact discs, a list of witnesses that included 50 possible law enforcement officers, 28 officers from the Sanford Police Department, 28 civilian witnesses, members of Martin's family, 2 of Zimmerman's friends and his father, Robert Zimmerman. Also listed as potential prosecution witnesses were technicians in biological and DNA evidence, trace evidence, gunshot residue, fingerprints, firearms, 2 FBI agents, 2 audio technicians who analyzed the emergency calls made during the confrontation to determine who was screaming in the background. Additional evidence released were audio and video recordings, photos, witness statements, forensic findings. Martin's autopsy report, evidence taken from Zimmerman after the shooting, his weapon, bullets, clothes, a DNA sample, medical records, and his cell phone data. 911 recordings, Zimmerman's voice stress test, Zimmerman's written statements, FBI interviews, photos of Martin's bloody sweatshirt and a hoodie, and several calls made by Zimmerman to Sanford police in the 6 months leading up to his encounter with Martin. On June 19th, Judge Nelson granted the defense request for access to Martin's school records, cell phone records, and social media, such as Facebook and Twitter. In her ruling, Nelson said that Zimmerman's attorneys needed to know whether Martin's school records and social media postings revealed any evidence that he had violent tendencies. Martin's parents said the defense's request for school records and social media was a fishing expedition aimed at attacking their son and an attempt to assassinate his character. She also ruled that Zimmerman's medical records be provided to prosecutors. Nelson said she would review the medical records and decide whether anything should be withheld. On May 28, 2013, Judge Nelson denied a defense motion to delay the trial for 6 weeks. She also declined the prosecution's request to implement a gag order to keep the lawyers from discussing the details of the case in the media. On June 10, 2013, jury selection began with 100 prospective jurors filling out questionnaires. 500 people received summonses, and the process for picking a jury was expected to take 2 weeks. At the request of the defense, the judge agreed to establish an anonymous jury, where the identity of the jury would be revealed only to the prosecution and defense, but not be released to the media nor the public. In the motion for the request, the defense said that jurors may be subject to rebuke and possible retribution should the verdict not comport with certain factors' desires in this matter. In Florida, juries consist of 6 people. 12 jurors are required only for criminal trials involving capital cases, where the death penalty is applicable. Zimmerman's jury consisted of 6 members and 4 alternates. The population of Seminole County is 10% African American, a percentage which may differ from that of the 500-member pool of potential jurors. During the 4th day of jury selection, Judge Nelson announced that the jury would be sequestered during the trial, which was expected to take 2 to 4 weeks. On June 18, 2013, 40 potential jurors, 16 men and 24 women, made it past the initial screening. The defense struck one potential juror, a female African American, as a stealth juror for failing to disclose that her pastor had advocated strongly on behalf of Trayvon Martin. The state attempted to strike one woman whose husband owned guns and who said she might have difficulty sending someone to prison. They also attempted to strike a woman who asked why Martin was out at night. The judge denied the strikes, and both women were part of the 6-person jury. The prosecution struck one potential juror who was a black gun owner who stated he watched Fox News. This particular prospective juror had been a defense favorite. On June 20th, 2013, jury selection was completed. 6 jurors and 4 alternates were selected. All 6 of the jurors were female, while 2 of the alternate jurors were male and 2 female. 5 of the jurors were white, and 1 was of mixed race. All of the alternates were white, and of those, 1 of the male alternates was said to have been a white Hispanic. The jury was sworn in, and all remaining potential jurors were dismissed. On June 24th, 2013, the prosecution delivered their 30-minute opening statement. Prosecutor John Guy began by quoting remarks made by Zimmerman during the non-emergency call, quote, "Fucking punks, these assholes always get away," end quote. The prosecution's statement focused on the lack of evidence of bodily harm to both Zimmerman and Martin, and portrayed Zimmerman as a liar who would be contradicted by witness and evidence. Guy also compared Zimmerman and Martin's physical size and commented on how small Martin was. The prosecution said Zimmerman was a wannabe cop who had participated in martial arts training, that he was looking for, quote, "people who didn't belong," end quote, and that he profiled Martin as someone about to commit a crime in his neighborhood. Don West made a lengthy opening statement for the defense, beginning with a knock-knock joke about jury selection. West stated that, quote, "there are no monsters," end quote, in this case, but that Zimmerman shot Martin after viciously being attacked. West stated that Zimmerman was sucker punched in the face and had his head hammered against the ground. West played Zimmerman's non-emergency phone call twice and used several visual aids to show jurors the location of various events in the case and to outline a timeline of phone calls and events. West asserted that Martin had plenty of time to go home during the phone calls, but decided to confront Zimmerman. West attempted to reconstruct the shooting using witness statements, crime scene photos, and a discussion of Zimmerman's injuries that used photos. West then described Zimmerman's actions after the incident and summarized witness and police statements and observation about Zimmerman's appearance and behavior. After the recess, West continued, pointing out that the gunshot was at contact range from Martin's sweatshirt, but several inches away from Martin's body, and said this proved that Martin was on top at the moment of the shot, with his shirt hanging down. The prosecution had the burden of convincing the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that George Zimmerman could not reasonably have believed that it was necessary to use deadly force to save himself from deadly bodily harm at the hands of Trayvon Martin. Under the facts of this case and the doubts concerning them, every astute observer knew that to be a difficult, possibly impossible task. The most compelling eyewitness testimony for the prosecution came from Jonathan Good, who lived in a townhome very near the confrontation and had the best view of the incident. When John Good looked out his door and saw some sort of tussle on the ground, he yelled, "What's going on?" and "Stop it." Good said the person on top wore a dark sweatshirt or shirt, and that the person underneath wore a lighter colored top, either red or white, he guessed. Zimmerman wore an orange top. He also described the person being straddled as having the lighter colored skin. He testified that he saw multiple downward thrusts of an arm from the person on top that looked like punches and heard the person on the bottom cry for help. When he turned to go inside his townhome and call 911, the gunshot rang out in the night. Shown photographs of both Zimmerman and Martin. Jonathan Good identified Martin as the person on the top and Zimmerman as the person on the bottom. He also aided the defense by stating that in his opinion, it was Zimmerman's voice screaming for help. The defense needed to show that Zimmerman had a reasonable fear of serious injury before he pulled the trigger, or at least to convince a jury that he might have had a serious reasonable fear of serious injury. This they would do primarily through testimony that it was Zimmerman's voice crying for help that was heard on the 911 recordings, and that he, not Martin, was on the bottom when the fatal shot was fired. Although not essential to the defense strategy, the defense also wanted to suggest that Zimmerman had reason to think that Martin might have been told the police dispatcher before the shooting up to no good. Many courtroom observers believe that the testimony of forensic pathologist Dr. Vincent DeMeo greatly strengthened the defense's case. DeMeo testified that his analysis revealed that the gun was touching Martin's sweatshirt and was 2 to 4 inches from Martin's body when the fatal bullet was fired. This, DeMeo said, is consistent with Zimmerman's story, that he was on the bottom and Martin was on top straddling him, because in that position, the sweatshirt would be hanging down from Martin's body a few inches. Quote, "The medical evidence is consistent with Zimmerman's statement," DeMeo concluded. DeMeo also described Zimmerman's head lacerations, temple wounds, and bloody nose as consistent with having had his head banged into the sidewalk and being punched in the nose, as Zimmerman claimed had happened. DeMeo also expressed his opinion that Trayvon Martin was probably conscious for about 10 to 15 seconds after being shot. Attorneys offered closing arguments on July the 12th. Prosecutor Bernie de la Ronda told jurors that Zimmerman was a lying wannabe cop who jumped to the unreasonable conclusion that Martin was a criminal. Because of Zimmerman, a teenager is dead through no fault of his own. Defense attorney Mark O'Mara argued that Zimmerman was not guilty of anything but protecting his own life. Holding up a chunk of concrete for the jury, O'Mara said Martin was not an innocent, unarmed teenager. Under the law, jurors must, O'Mara insisted, to give the benefit of the doubt to Zimmerman. Prosecutor John Guy had the final word. He asked jurors to look into the heart of Zimmerman and remember that if he had done what he should have done, stayed in the car and waited for the police to arrive, Trayvon Martin would still be alive. Quote, "This case is not about standing your ground. It's about staying in your car, end quote. However, as many observers point out, getting out of your car, even getting out of your car to follow someone you unreasonably think might be a criminal, is not a crime, however foolish it might be. After Judge Nelson offered instructions on what the jury must find in order to return a verdict of either second-degree murder or the lesser included charge of manslaughter, the jury commenced deliberations. According to later statements by two members of the jury was initially split. At least three jurors were firmly convinced that Zimmerman was not guilty of either murder or manslaughter, while the other three preferred to find him guilty on at least one of the two charges. The jurors supporting the not guilty verdict proved to be the more persuasive, arguing that whether or not Zimmerman profiled Martin or was foolish in following him was legally irrelevant to the charges. As deliberations progressed, the jurors initially inclined to find Zimmerman guilty came around to the view that the law says at the end of the day, all that matters is who was on top of who and who was at the bottom. And the evidence suggested Martin was on top and Zimmerman was on the bottom. Or at the very least, there was a reasonable basis for believing that to be the case. After 16 hours of debating the evidence, the jury returned its verdict of not guilty. On July 13, 2013, shortly after the trial verdict, the U.S. Justice Department issued a statement saying its investigation into the civil rights aspect of the case was continuing. On February 24, 2015, 35 months after it began, the civil rights investigation of the Justice Department was terminated for lack of evidence. The FBI investigation was concurrently terminated for the exact same reason. Trayvon Martin's death can be analyzed as a catalyst incident for the Black Lives Matter movement. The term Black Lives Matter was mainly integrated into social literature through hashtags on Twitter in response to the acquittal of Zimmerman and has now grown in its prevalence and significance politically. In simple terms, Black Lives Matter can be described as an activist movement in which supporters strive for equality, liberation, and justice of Black people. The organization has continued to acknowledge issues of racial inequality and acknowledge widespread police murders, including Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, and numerous others. The effects of BLM have been paralleled by countries around the world, shifting police brutality into the public eye and requiring reflection regarding the multiple fields and impacts, including economics, morality, and equality. In terms of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, it enabled an outlet in which protesters could demand justice and disseminate a social power and strength within communities, with its participants perpetuating a widespread call to action through these protests and conventions. The Black Lives Matter movement has been referred to by several writers in the New York Times as the largest social movement in the U.S. history. In James Loden's book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, Loman states the following: people have a right to their own opinions, but not their own facts. Evidence must be located, not created, and opinions not backed by evidence cannot be given much weight. Zimmerman concluded that Martin was suspicious without any evidence, and then found the facts to back up his foregone conclusion. It's psychologically easier for us to blame the jury than it is for us to blame the law. In this case, the facts are that George Zimmerman is not guilty, at least in a legal sense. It's Florida's laws that are guilty. This is Freshly Squeezed True Crime. Thank you. You can find us on fstcpodcast.com, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and listen to us wherever you listen to your podcast. This episode was squeezed to perfection. Goodbye.